Donald Trump has just frozen $89 billion in Canadian government and institutional accounts held inside American banks. To accomplish this, he relied on the same legal authority the United States has previously employed to freeze the assets of nations like Iran, Russia, North Korea, Syria, and Venezuela. The legislation is called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a financial instrument normally reserved for hostile governments and terrorist-linked states. Yet this time it was directed against America's closest neighbor. Mark Carney's reaction arrived in under 6 hours. And what he didn't simply respond to the freeze. It triggered the largest single-day movement of foreign sovereign assets out of American financial institutions in the entire recorded history of the global financial system. Roughly $2.3 trillion suddenly went into motion, all because of a single sentence Carney delivered to governments across the world. Warren Buffett later described it as the most self-destructive financial decision by an American president since Richard Nixon closed the gold window in 1971. But the element that truly astonished financial observers was this: Trump froze $89 billion that was barely present in the first place. Canada had quietly relocated most of its funds out of American banks during the preceding 90 days. In effect, the freeze was like aiming a loaded weapon at an empty vault, and Carney used that moment to persuade the entire world to empty their vaults as well. To understand how this unfolded, it is important to walk through what actually transpired. Trump signed the executive order on a Sunday evening, and it took effect early Monday morning. The order invoked the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, which grants the U.S. President sweeping authority to freeze foreign assets if the executive branch declares a national emergency. This law is not a standard trade instrument. It is not a tariff or a minor sanction. It is among the most powerful financial weapons accessible to the United States government. The same statute was employed to freeze Iranian assets following the hostage crisis and later to secure Russian oligarch fortunes after the invasion of Ukraine. Every prior application of this authority targeted governments considered adversaries, rivals, or rogue states. And now that same weapon had been directed at Canada. The executive order froze 3 categories of Canadian assets. First were Canadian government accounts maintained in U.S. banks. Second were accounts belonging to Crown corporations, meaning financial holdings connected to Canadian state-owned enterprises. Third were Canadian institutional investment accounts, encompassing pension funds and major university endowments. Altogether, the United States believed it had frozen approximately $89 billion. The official justification referenced an economic emergency caused by hostile Canadian trade measures that allegedly threatened American national security and economic stability. Legal scholars swiftly challenged that reasoning. The IEEPA requires a genuine national emergency, and a trade dispute with a democratic neighbor that shares the world's longest undefended border does not ordinarily satisfy that threshold. The freeze occurred instantly. There was no phase-in period and no diplomatic forewarning. Canadian financial officials discovered what had happened only when Monday morning transactions failed to process. Wire transfers suddenly bounced. Account access was denied. Canada's finance ministry first learned about the situation from urgent phone calls placed by its own banking institutions, not from the White House. There had been no phone call and no diplomatic communication. Canadian institutions simply attempted to access their funds and discovered that a foreign government had locked the door overnight. The intended strategy from Washington appeared straightforward. With $89 billion frozen inside American banks, Canada would face tremendous pressure to arrive at the negotiating table under U.S. conditions. The money was intended to serve as leverage. The accounts themselves were effectively captive. It was the logic of coercion applied to international finance, and it depended on the assumption that Canada had no contingency arrangement. That assumption proved entirely incorrect. Mark Carney had devoted 13 years at Goldman Sachs learning how global financial systems operate. He had directed the Bank of Canada through the global financial crisis and later served as governor of the Bank of England during Brexit. For months, he had been preparing for precisely this kind of scenario. 6 hours after the freeze took effect, Carney appeared behind a podium in Ottawa. He opened with a composed statement that immediately stunned journalists across the world. "I want to assure Canadians and the international community," he said, "that Canada's financial position remains secure." Then he delivered the critical detail. The actions taken by the United States had affected approximately $12 billion in Canadian institutional assets, not $89 billion, $12 billion. The room fell completely silent. Carney explained that Canadian intelligence services, collaborating with the Bank of Canada, had spent the previous 4 months assessing the probability of an American asset freeze. Once that risk shifted from possible to probable, Canada initiated an internal operation designated as Operation Sovereign Shield. Over the course of 90 days, Canada quietly and methodically withdrew sovereign and institutional funds from U.S. financial institutions. The transfers were executed gradually and carefully in amounts modest enough to avoid drawing market attention. The money was relocated into Canadian domestic banks, into custodial facilities managed by the Bank of England, and into accounts associated with the European Central Bank. Certain assets were transferred into a new Canadian sovereign wealth structure headquartered in Switzerland. Every transaction had been arranged in advance, and every receiving institution had already been coordinated. The entire operation was carried out with the precision of a central banker who thoroughly understood how capital moves through the global financial system. Of the $89 billion Washington believed it had frozen, roughly $77 billion had already been repositioned before the order was issued. The remaining $12 billion had been deliberately left behind in small residual balances so that the accounts would not appear suspiciously vacant. In other words, Trump froze $89 billion that wasn't genuinely there. He directed a financial weapon at a vault that had been quietly emptied over 3 months by a government that anticipated the weapon might be coming. That was Carney's opening move. The second move arrived less than an hour later. Canada responded by freezing all American government and corporate assets held inside Canadian financial institutions under its own Special Economic Measures Act. The total value reached roughly $143 billion. These frozen assets included U.S. corporate operating accounts for subsidiaries throughout Canada, American pension fund investments in Canadian equities, U.S. government securities held through Canadian intermediaries, and operating capital belonging to American bank branches. Canada had frozen $143 billion, while the United States had actually captured only $12 billion. The party applying pressure suddenly discovered 2 things simultaneously. The target had already departed, and the target possessed 12 times as many assets of its own. Carney's third move unsettled financial markets even further. He delivered another public statement directed specifically toward the international community. If the United States of America will freeze the financial assets of its closest ally, a NATO partner, a G7 nation, and a Five Eyes intelligence partner, then no country's assets held in American financial institutions are truly secure. Not European assets, not Japanese assets, not Korean or Australian assets. Then he delivered the line that will likely appear in finance literature for decades to come. Your money in American banks is not a deposit, it is a hostage. That sentence reverberated through the global financial system. Not because it was sensational, but because policymakers everywhere immediately grasped the implication. Every finance minister, central banker, and sovereign wealth fund manager understood what the rational course of action would be. Move the money. Carney's fourth step accelerated the transition. He announced that Canada would activate a Canadian-European settlement platform for commerce with European Union nations, bypassing the U.S. dollar entirely. He revealed new currency swap agreements with Japan, South Korea, the United Kingdom, and Australia. and he declared that Canadian sovereign reserves would be maintained only in non-U.S. financial institutions going forward. 4 moves in 6 hours. The vault had already been emptied. Canada had counter-frozen assets at a 12-to-1 margin. And one sentence had alerted the entire world that their funds might not be protected. The freeze itself resembled a pistol. Carney transformed it into something closer to a financial seismic event. Markets reacted immediately, not to the freeze alone, but to the broader warning it carried. The Dow Jones Industrial Average began declining the moment Carney's second statement reached financial newswires. Bank stocks led the descent. J.P. Morgan Chase dropped roughly 9%. Bank of America slid 12%. Citigroup plunged 14%. Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, and Morgan Stanley all surrendered between 8 and 15%. It became the worst single-day performance for U.S. bank stocks since the early phase of the pandemic. The underlying reason was structural. If foreign governments begin withdrawing sovereign assets from American banks, those institutions lose deposits, the low-cost funding that international holdings provide. Within hours, Norway's sovereign wealth fund initiated an emergency review of its exposure to U.S. financial institutions. Saudi Arabia's public investment fund began precautionary relocations. Singapore's GIC and Temasek announced they were reassessing jurisdictional concentration risk. The European Central Bank convened an emergency session. Within 24 hours, an estimated $2.3 trillion in global assets had entered transfer or review protocols. Consider the scale of that proportion. Trump froze $89 billion in Canadian accounts, of which only $12 billion actually remained. Carney's response triggered movement or review of $2.3 trillion in global assets. That represents nearly a 200-to-1 reaction. The U.S. dollar declined 3.2% against a basket of major currencies, registering its worst single-day drop in more than 10 years. The decline was not driven by trade statistics or economic indicators. It was propelled by a sudden erosion of confidence. The dollar's position as the world's reserve currency depends on foreign governments trusting that their assets are insulated from political interference. That confidence required decades to establish, and suddenly it appeared fragile. Warren Buffett's statement carried substantial weight. Berkshire Hathaway holds significant investments in American bank stocks, and the market decline was costing his company billions as he spoke. "I've been investing in American financial institutions for 60 years, Buffett said. Today, for the first time in those 60 years, I'm questioning that decision. He compared freezing an ally's bank accounts to setting your own home on fire to inconvenience your neighbor, except the home you ignite is the one where everyone else stores their valuables. The U.S. financial system operates as the world's central bank, Buffett elaborated. Nations store reserves there because they trust those funds are shielded from political risk. That trust required approximately 80 years to construct. And it may have been compromised by a single executive order. Buffett also remarked on Carney's response. Carney didn't actually need to defeat the freeze, he noted. The freeze defeated itself. All Carney had to do was gesture toward it and say, "Observe what they did to us. You could be next." 11 words altered everything. Your money in American banks is not a deposit. It is a hostage. The global consequences kept expanding. Within 48 hours, 11 sovereign wealth funds formally announced reviews of their diversification strategies, encompassing roughly $4.7 trillion in combined assets. The European Central Bank accelerated plans for euro-based alternatives to dollar clearing systems. China broadened yuan settlement agreements with additional nations. And Canada, the country that was intended to be devastated by the freeze, was operating normally. Canadian banks reported increased deposits as funds flowed back into domestic institutions. The Toronto Stock Exchange even rose modestly, as certain investors concluded that Canada had become the more dependable financial jurisdiction. The financial instrument had struck the wrong target. It was engineered to damage Canada. Canada's markets advanced. America's markets declined. Senior executives in the U.S. banking sector reportedly responded with considerable frustration. J.P. Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon allegedly communicated to officials in Washington that the order had just provided every foreign government on Earth with a rationale to withdraw deposits from American banks. The Federal Reserve promptly began discussing potential liquidity support frameworks as foreign funds gradually began departing U.S. institutions, not through panic, but through deliberate and permanent reallocation. So, where did circumstances stand once the situation stabilized? Trump signed an order freezing $89 billion in Canadian assets, but Canada had already transferred $77 billion, leaving only $12 billion actually immobilized. Canada then counterfroze $143 billion in American assets, a 12-to-1 countermeasure. Carney's warning sentence triggered movement or review of $2.3 trillion away from U.S. financial institutions. Bank stocks forfeited hundreds of billions in market value. The dollar experienced its sharpest single-day decline in over a decade. The dollar's influence has never rested purely on military capacity. It depends on trust, the belief that American financial institutions are reliable repositories for storing wealth. For 8 decades, that trust underpinned American economic supremacy. And suddenly, the world began reconsidering it. Trump believed he was penalizing Canada. But Canada had already relocated its money. The genuine damage was inflicted on the global perception of the dollar itself. Because once the notion spreads that deposits might become political instruments, the rational response is straightforward. Move the money.